Thank you, Gail, and thank you, Andrew and Benita, for the invitation to be here. Can everybody hear me all right? So I'm going to do this kind of dance between if I take my glasses off, I can't see you, and if I put them on, I can't read the screen. So I'm in this indeterminate zone. It's also going to be, it was interesting, we had that discussion about, detecting mild cognitive impairment yesterday. And so this will be actually a small mocha test if I can remember the instructions that Gail just actually nicely gave me on advancing slides and where to point the clicker. So did I get this correct? Ah, there we go. Okay. So I have to do both. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ethical considerations and adaptive platform trials. And just to sort of set you up for the main event, there's somebody in the room who actually really knows what she's talking about, and that's my friend and colleague, Professor Lisa Schwartz. So you'll be hearing from her as well. So I've broken it down into 4 components. One is obligations of researchers. 2 is talking about basic concepts in research ethics, then extending that into adaptive designs. And then 4 is about sort of foreshadow something that Andrew mentioned yesterday about how we see adaptive platform trials as part of a learning health system ecology. So 1 and 4 are editorial. I'm going to be a little bit on my soapbox, and for that I will only apologize if I offend someone. 2 and 3 will be kind of substantive things that anybody who's involved in adaptive designs need to know. Why 1 and 4 are I consider editorial is I come at this not just as somebody who's been on REBs, formed REBs, chaired REBs, done research in research ethics, but I've also been a researcher for 25, 30 years, an empirical researcher. I've done, every kind of study you can imagine, randomized trials, health services research, mixed methods, qualitative studies. And what I find is we have a system where people don't really want to talk to each other or understand each other's points of view. And I couldn't help but being triggered yesterday by the whole Bayes frequentist discussion, which just really speaks to how there are, principal differences of opinion in how best to understand probability and optimize data analysis, which actually is not too different from the kind of debates and discussions you will find in research ethics, where you're going to actually, as a PI, have to make a case to an REB that you're actually living up to your responsibilities for human subject protection. Point 4 just speaks to the absolute general wastefulness of information in health systems. One of my dreams was about a decade ago, was to turn a hospital into a living adaptive platform trial machine, perpetual motion machine, recognizing that every encounter between a patient and a healthcare system is an opportunity to learn, and 99.99% of those encounters are squandered. We collect information that we can't use to learn from. It's not fit for purpose. So I'm hoping that the next generation of researchers will push this forward to actually help us evolve into a learning health system ecology where we're not squandering all of that information. It actually goes nowhere. It sits in charts. It's interesting because by law, as a clinician, and many clinicians in the audience, we have to record our patient encounters, right? It's a regulatory responsibility. And you ask yourself, well, why are we recording that if not for forensic purposes, like to make sure if somebody ever complains and goes back and litigates you for malpractice or negligence? But also it's actually a record of an encounter, of decisions being made, of information being processed that is actually critically underused. Okay. So why does ethics matter to research at all? Why are we even here? Why was I even invited? So along with being a researcher, I've taught and supervised and mentored a lot of researchers. And what we failed, so we're really good at universities and training PhDs, right? So, but do they know how to be a principal investigator? Do they know about what their obligations are? So you'll note, I know the mind of a doctoral student very well because I've supervised about 50 of them, and you're really concerned about getting your dissertation defended and your papers, your postdoc lined up and your papers published. And we're really good about training people how to be, how to ask a question and answer it with a methodology. And then we turn them loose to become principal investigators, where all of a sudden, then you think, oh, I've got to get a grant, but then you've got a couple of grants, and now you're actually running a small business. You have obligations to staff, you have human resource and hiring decisions, and then you realize that the soft money economy, once you've trained up an RA to really function well, you've got to keep them all together. So we have a set of, but the other point is that we often don't talk about why we do health research in the first place. What's the big point of it all? And, when I ask my students, why do you do research? And they go, I want to make a contribution to knowledge. Well, you can do that in geology. You can do that in astronomy. What brought you into the field of health research? And inevitably, they'll stumble on the thing. Well, I want to improve humanity. I want to make a difference in making lives better. And then you think, well, why do you want to do that? What's the big why? Why don't you, optimize protozoan health or, squirrels' health? Why human health? And then eventually you'll get to this notion that there is an ethical foundation upon which all human research rests, and that's to gain knowledge to improve human well-being. Why? Because we believe that human well-being in some way, shape, or form is a good that we should seek to realize. Second point I want to raise is that there's actually no right to be a researcher. And I've actually had this experience as a chair of an REB where an aggrieved PI would come and say, you're violating my rights. And I have to tell them, I'm sorry, but as a researcher, you don't have any rights, you have privileges. And researchers are probably amongst the last group of self-regulating agents. There's no regulatory body to enforce standards as in the health professions. We're our own gatekeepers. And as you know, and if you've been around for a while, you know that every violation of an ethical norm really results in a regulatory backlash that makes our lives as researchers even more difficult. So we're responsible for our own behavior, and the historical record has not been as pure as we'd like it to be. And our obligations to enrolled participants. So if you're doing, health services research, a lot of the ethics work is baked in because the hard work of de-identifying the data, of securing the data, of making sure that the data, management plans and the privacy impact assessments have all been done. But if you're actually working with, embodied, living, breathing humans, your obligations to those participants are as stringent as the obligation a physician has to the well-being of their patient. But it's never taught that way. So the other thing I want to point out then is that ethics, they come and talk about ethics in research, people say, oh, it's all about the REB, but it's way more than just REB approval. It relates to the integrity of the entire structure of the ethics research and ecosystem. Oh, so I forgot. So I like this quotation. So in the substantive part, I will be drawing on some recent scholarship by colleagues and friends of mine. Particularly, I'd like to acknowledge Jerome Singh from South Africa, who has done some very pioneering thinking on ethics and adaptive platform designs and governance issues, as well as colleagues from the World Health Organization. The reason being is that, we had a little bit of a discussion of it yesterday. If we go back to the Ebola outbreak of 2014, and Lisa and I were involved in this in a group that I chaired, a group that looked at ethical considerations for clinical trials in public health emergencies. And even back then, we were thinking very clearly about the need for and advocating for the need for platform adaptive approaches to in public health emergencies. So we saw them rolled out in various ways. 3 or 4 of them at least had made significant contributions during COVID. And the WHO group has kind of distilled some of that wisdom into these governance documents. So they point out that ethics considerations are inherent in the decisions made throughout every aspect of clinical research, when it is conceived, funded, planned, reviewed, implemented, and disseminated. And research ethics committees provide independent reviews of some of these decisions. However, such safeguards do not in themselves make research practice ethical. And that speaks back to the points I was making earlier about your obligations as PIs to have your house in order and to set the highest possible standards. So I know we're not supposed to talk about research integrity here because people say, well, research integrity and responsible conduct of research are over here, and research ethics review is over here. But for about the past 10 years at the university, I've been teaching this to people in clinical epidemiology. And I thought, I'm going to use the opportunity to combine both because otherwise you won't get exposed to either. So one is this notion about scientists behaving badly. And this is a paper published in Nature in 2005. It identifies the top 10 bad behaviors. It's been updated in a meta-analysis, but this is the largest study, 3,247 scientists funded by the NIH. And basically my bottom line, I've got 2 slides that provide the bottom line for what you need to know, is here's 10 things, don't do them, right? Don't falsify your data. And the interesting thing is that in a survey, approximately 0.5% of early career researchers admitted to falsifying data. And you think about, social desirability bias in surveys. The fact, is this an underestimate? Is it an overestimate? The fact that there's an estimate is actually, I think, revealing. Don't ignore major aspects of human subject requirements. And that's one of the things I know people get frustrated sometimes by delays. In another lecture, I can disabuse you of the fact that it really isn't the REB that wastes your time as a researcher. If you look all things considered, the time to get your grant and the time to publication actually exceeds the time that your protocol is in the REB. And with Lisa and others, we've actually measured those intervals. And it was very revealing when we went back to the investigator group and said, you're complaining about the time it takes for us to approve your protocols. But when we calculated it out, it's in your hands more than it's in our hands. So if you think about these as interval times from time 1 when you submit your protocol to the time when you get approval, then we have it for a little while, we give it back to you, you give it back to us, we look at it, we give it back to you, and you have to make amendments. And when you calculate that interval, it actually spends a lot of time more in the investigator's hands than the REB's hands. And this is a preventable, I'm getting ahead of myself. You can prevent this by actually filling out your REB application properly in the first place. It's one of the few parts of the research ecosystem where you're actually given instructions. They're called guidelines. In Canada, it's a Tri-Council policy statement. It tells you what you need to think about. And as we all know, many of us are experienced researchers here, grant review and journal peer review is an absolute random walk. How do you become a reviewer for grants? You get a grant. How do you become a reviewer for a journal? You publish a paper. And very few people are given instructions on how to be a constructive peer reviewer for grants and journal articles. And as recent Cochrane reviews have suggested, there's not a whole lot of evidence that peer review of grants or journals actually adds much, but it does take time. So there's another metric, which is time to publication, which actually extends into the years from the time when grants are funded and data is finished being collected. So don't falsify research data. Don't ignore your research ethics guidelines. Please disclose all of your financial relationships that may be in the background. Relationships with students and research subjects that might be questionable, using other people's ideas without obtaining permission or giving due credit, unauthorized use of confidential information, don't present data that, failing to present data that contradicts one's own previous research. And you can see the prevalence gets higher, overlooking others' use of flawed data or questionable interpretation of data. And of course, coming from yesterday, there's always questions about interpretation of data and what makes it appropriate. And don't change the design methodology or results of a study in response to pressure from a funding source. Now, I recognize that all investigators at whatever part of their career they're in are facing immense pressures. Grant funding success rates are low. You know, there's pressure to publish, and often this notion that that you might want to take shortcuts, but that will come with considerable backlash. The other issue is, oops, sorry. Honesty. And I don't know how many of you follow Retraction Watch, but fraudulent science and ghostwriting. This was a particularly harrowing piece of work published about a decade ago about how a particular pharmaceutical company basically purchased the medical literature through supplements. And what they were trying to do, there was a big class action suit against the company. It has to do with estrogen and breast cancer. And it was in a class action suit follows tort law in the US, which means you just have to show on balance of probabilities, whatever that might be, a harm has been done. You don't have to meet the clear and unequivocal standard. And the best way to do that is to have a bunch of peer-reviewed literature that casts doubt on that association. And the interesting thing here was that the opinions of many very prominent researchers in the US and Canada were purchased. So they would be given, they made a distinction between writing and authorship. And so they were given first authorship, but they didn't actually write the paper or analyze the data. And there were parameters around which you weren't allowed to change. And really the things you weren't allowed to change was this interpretation that was casting doubt on the association between estrogen and breast cancer, because those would all be then, because they're peer-reviewed medical journals, be entered in evidence at a tort case. And that would actually help move the balance of probabilities to casting doubt on the association. So don't do that either. Pretty simple. Okay, bare essentials. Okay. So I alluded to, you know, I think our understanding of history is important, and Andrew has mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. Besides the call to actions, every Canadian should actually read the report. It's quite lengthy. I use it in a class that I teach on the history of public health. And I teach, of course, also on tuberculosis. And we were looking at the history of tuberculosis in Indian residential schools. And whenever, you know, over the past few months or years, when we've been talking about all of these discovered bodies, most of those children died of tuberculosis. And in fact, they said, if you ever wanted to create the most perfect machine for generating a high burden of tuberculosis, the residential schools, which were federally funded and supported by our institutions, were really great at that. So research ethics exists because researchers have taken liberties over the years with human subjects. The most egregious, of course, were the World War II war crimes, famously led to what's called the Nuremberg Code, which was the first research ethics, well, maybe the second, depending on your history. And it was short, it was 1 page, and it started with the voluntary, not the informed, but the voluntary consent of the participant in research is inviolable. And we'll come to consent because I, heard some things coming out of some of the results yesterday that consent processes are burdensome. Most of you know about the Tuskegee syphilis study, where men with Black African-American men with syphilis were denied access to curative treatment because the CDC was interested in the natural history of syphilis. And all of these studies are, my favorite is the San Antonio contraceptive study, which was a placebo-controlled trial, favorite in the dark. sense, placebo-controlled study of oral contraceptive pills in which the control group was not told that they were on a placebo. So, of course, the pregnancy rate was high when they thought they were being protected. And if you want to look at more, there's more. But the reason we have research ethics frameworks is because researchers have taken liberties with research participants and harmed them. Research has the capacity to do harm. We all believe in beneficence, that we're going to get the answer and we're going to do good for humanity. But history shows, one, that there's a lot of null studies. That means people have been enrolled, and this is why platform adaptive approaches are important. People are enrolled in studies, exposed to risk, and there's no demonstration of benefit. Also, there's potential for harm. So always remember that if you enroll a human subject in a study, you as a researcher have the capacity to harm that person, and it's your obligation, duty, and responsibility to minimize that probability. So with those are also correlative evolutions of codes. I mentioned already the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki by the World Medical Association, Belmont Report, which formed the basis of US guidance documents. There's now a lot of national guidelines. And if you're involved in international research or global research, make sure you understand the local REB process and the local or national guidelines in the country that you're working in. Again, is it an inconvenience? Maybe, but it's your obligation as a researcher to know these and abide by them. And in Canada, of course, we have the Tri-Council policy statement. So the Tri-Council policy statement is interesting because it mandates minimal and universal standards. But here's a point I want to make, and I'll come to at the end. It's a living document. It's not a finished document. It's not like the 10 commandments of thou shalt. People who work on the Tri-Council policy statement understand that research is a highly dynamic environment, that standards and ways of doing research and new designs are coming on. And as you look back, if you look at the first Tri-Council policy document to where it is now, you will see that it's been updated. Now there's a recognition of special concern for Indigenous communities. So there's a chapter on research in Indigenous communities. With population health and public health, there are guidance documents that have been evolved. And you, as a researcher, have an opportunity to contribute to this. And one of the points I'd like to make is that those researchers who actually participate in REBs are less dissatisfied with the REB process than those that don't. And as an academic citizen, and when you become a faculty member, this always bothers me. It's like, it's our turn to nominate somebody for the REB, and they pull the straws, whoever gets the short straw, I have to be on the REB but take it as an opportunity to learn, because you will actually benefit from it, he says, without any evidence. But no, there is evidence, actually. So it sets out what types of research require review, and REBs are responsible for ethics review of research involving human subjects as research. It also sets out what an REB does, and its responsibilities. And the REB has that kind of quasi-regulatory role to approve, disapprove, propose modifications, or terminate any proposed or ongoing research involving human subjects. So they have that authority. And also, I don't have a slide filling it. The composition of an REB only requires one person who's familiar with ethics. When I hear a lot of complaints about REBs, I wish we used the US nomenclature and called them institutional review boards, because there's actually not a lot of ethics expertise required to be on an REB. You need subject matter experts. So when if you're complaining about the REB, you're actually complaining about your peers, even though we don't think of REB as peer review. And a community member. So I would argue that we need to upgrade the minimal requirements for our REB membership, but that would get me in trouble as well. And the review process is meant to adopt a proportionate approach to ethics review based on the principle that the more potentially invasive or harmful the research, the more care should be taken in its review. So the focus is on human subject protection. And, we've seen over the years now that certain studies can qualify for so-called delegated. We used to call it expedited. We don't like that. Delegated review, which means somebody's going to look at it and probably give you a fairly quick approval. And for a while, back in from 2006 to 2011, I was the director of the Joint Center for Bioethics. And we created this group called RE², Research and Education and Research Ethics. And what our goal was to say, when something isn't working, you don't yell at it. If your computer isn't working, you don't yell at your computer. If the reagents aren't behaving the way you think they should, or your results aren't coming out, you don't yell at them. So why do we yell at REBs and think that that's going to solve the problems rather than making them into researchable problems in the spirit of quality improvement or, a new knowledge generation? Make a list of all of those pressure points and then fund research to actually address this. But are pleased, just like turning a hospital into an adaptive platform itself, fell on deaf ears, so to speak. So what are the key elements that you need to, over there, yeah. So here's basically the 5 key imperatives. So the moral imperative, or the underlying in the TCPS, is this respect for human dignity, respect for whatever, we can get into. There's as many views on what dignity is as there is of views on what a probability is, just to frame that. So if somebody's sitting out there saying, oh yeah, I'm sure, what do you mean by dignity? And I'll say, well, what do you mean by probability? No, I'm just kidding. But respect for free and informed consent, going back to Nuremberg, point 1. And, we need to think about ways in which we do consent better. That's a researchable topic. And, in global health, there is often a concern, we can't get consent from people who have low levels of literacy or are illiterate. And you might know Partners in Health and Paul Farmer, they were in Haiti and they said, we're gonna actually look at this as a challenge. So they did a randomized control trial of different ways of obtaining consent from people with low literacy or illiteracy, and found that you could actually get an informed consent on participation in a randomized trial using visual methods. Right? It's not required that you read a document and sign it, but you do need to have an attestation that information has been communicated, understood, and somebody has agreed to that. So, and I think when I get to the platform adaptive trial side, there are some really interesting challenges in informed consent. Respect for vulnerable persons, again, like dignity, vulnerability is a contested term. What do we mean by vulnerable? What we mean is that people who are at additional risk and maybe and those risks may be enhanced by their participation in research. Respect for privacy and confidentiality, disclosure, maintaining your information. We still have troubles with that. Respect for justice and inclusiveness. We've had a little bit of discussion about how large segments of if we believe that research brings benefits to humanity, there are large segments of not just the Canadian population, but the global population who have been excluded from the possibility of participating in research. There's been a large discussion about whether pregnant women are eligible to be involved in research because they've been judged vulnerable by someone somewhere and therefore not able to participate. And of course, balancing harms and benefits. So those are the core 5 principles. And I know this is probably almost impossible to read, and I apologize for this. So Ezekiel Emanuel, you may know, he was the head of the NIH Bioethics Center for a long time. But he wrote this paper and published it in JAMA called What Makes Clinical Research Ethical, in which he identifies 7 requirements, 5 of which I've already spoken to. He gives an explanation of why it's an issue, justifying ethical values, and the expertise for evaluation. So as a clinician, I remember back to my days as a clinical clerk running around the wards, just feeling the weight of medical knowledge that I hadn't mastered. And in those days, we didn't have phones or apps. So we had our pockets stuffed with white cards. You pull it out and the oxygen dissociation curve, or here's the, how to run a code. And you kind of read it and try to do it. So that 10 things you shouldn't do as a researcher, and these 7 requirements on both sides of a white card would basically give you enough to pragmatically go out there and at least be on the right path. So the requirement of social or scientific value is very important. A majority of our research comes from publicly funded sources. We have an obligation not to squander those resources, to use them to answer questions that are of importance. And again, another silence here is actually engaging with communities to set priorities. Whose question predominates, right? Typically it's research or investigator driven, but we want to find ways to better involve communities. And that's an issue around scarce resources and non-exploitation. And yeah, you need scientists' expertise, but you also need citizens' understanding of priorities and the importance of research. So we have to continually, as researchers, particularly in a somewhat increasingly hostile to science environment, articulate and defend the values upon which the scientific enterprise is based. Why do we do it? Scientific validity, that seems like a no-brainer, but you need to use accepted methods, including the appropriate statistical technique, which as we know is subject to some discussion. And again, scarce resources, and again, this is something where probably, scientific and statistical knowledge and also understanding of the population you're serving. Fair subject selection. How is it that you identify people, make sure that you're not systematically targeting or excluding people? That's a principle of justice, and it requires, yes, scientific knowledge, but you can't bootstrap justice out of data. You need to have a framework and an understanding of concepts to get there. Favorable risk-benefit ratio, we talked a lot about that already. Independent review. So an REB is meant to be independent from the science, and we created that for a good reason, because for all of the reasons that I've articulated, historical affronts to subjects. But also, researchers can be a little bit enthusiastic, and even though they say they have undisturbed priors about their hypothesis, they might have a rooting interest in it. So we need an independent review, just like we have peer review of grants, peer review of our publications. We need and they're independent. You can't nominate unless you're doing like the one researcher did with online publications. He invented all of the peer reviewers, gave them emails, and they all went to him. And of course, he favorably reviewed his own work. I think he did this about 24 times before people caught on to him. So that's another thing. Don't do that, right? So we need independent review in order to persuade or give credence to the integrity of the process. Informed consent we'll come back to, but the provision of information to subjects about the purpose of the research, its procedures, potential risks, benefits, and alternatives, so that the people you're enrolling actually understand what it is they're getting into, and they can make a voluntary decision to participate or not. And there's a large literature about whether you can actually ever get truly informed consent, whether people actually understand the risks. And then if you dig down into how we actually think about risks, do we as scientists even understand what risks are? So there's limits to that, but you have to, to respect the subject and the subject's authority. And again, science and ethics need to be combined, and respect for potential and enrolled subjects. So they need to know that they can exit the study at any time without any compromise to their care. That sometimes gets a bit confusing. To protect their privacy We need to inform subjects of newly discovered risks or benefits, which is a particular challenge for our platform adaptive trials, because you've got, interim analysis, you've got arms coming in and out, and that raises some interesting wrinkles that we'll get to shortly. And, maintaining their welfare. And again, that's your obligation as a PI. This is on you. This is your responsibility. If you want to be a researcher and you don't want to uphold these standards, I suggest you get out of human research and, I don't know, maybe study trees or rocks, where you don't have to be, where that burden of actually protecting welfare is not on you. Okay, challenges and opportunities in adaptive platform trials. So just in general, all of what I've just said, all of those considerations of ethical review, all of those 7 criteria pertain to adaptive platform trials. Nothing changes. Just because you're doing an adaptive platform design doesn't mean you don't have to worry about consent or, fair subject selection or privacy and confidentiality. All of those carried forward into the ethical landscape of adaptive platform trials. They are considered novel designs, even though they've been used for some time. And I think some people were mentioning yesterday, FDA, do they really get this? Or do, Health Canada, our regulators up to speed? So again, when you see a gap between what you think are understandings in the research ecosystem, you can, say, well, they just don't get me, I don't get it. Or you can actually do something about it, right? So you can say, okay, we think that adaptive platform designs are really important knowledge generation, that they have certain benefits and properties that fixed RCTs don't have. But there's a lot of people in the landscape that don't understand that. So help them understand it, right? And that's, again, you might not see that as your job, but as a community of researchers, it is our job. It's our job to explain the methods so that people who are reviewing them and vetting them and approving the results of them for regulatory authority actually understand them. And so somebody's got to take that on. And our job on the ethics side, and Lisa and I have done some of this work, is to, a lot of REBs have limited experience in their review of adaptive platform design. So we need to engage in continuing professional development. As I've mentioned, research ethics is a constantly evolving landscape, which means that there's learning needs. But it's, does the CIHR want to fund, who's going to fund an educational intervention to bring REBs up to speed? We've tried to go to places like the Wellcome Trust or others, but for a while, the Fogarty International Center and the NIH was interested in this. But again, we need to advocate for resources to generate knowledge to improve all aspects of the research ecosystem. And this, again, I can't overemphasize this enough, is the importance of a mutually respectful relationship between the PI and the REB. You're allowed to talk to the REB chair. You're allowed to engage. So all of you who work in research institutes, the other thing is sometimes you can actually ask your, VP research, I would like to have a research ethics consultant in the Research Institute. And what's a research ethics consultant? This was pioneered in Stanford when genomics research came on board. And the REB was really struggling with genomic research because they didn't understand the techniques and the methodologies. So they actually hired a really sharp geneticist who had an interest in research ethics to serve as a consultant to the researchers. Independent, this person did not serve on the REB, but understood the landscape of ethics review and understood the landscape of the research and the methodologies, and helped the PIs to frame their proposals to the REB in a way that it was understandable. And it was a very successful intervention. And we have not taken it up do you know of any place in Canada, Lisa, that has one? No. So, ask for it. We've trained lots of people, because then it's going to help everybody. Ask your REB to set up a decision bank. I think Sally Bean at Sunnybrook did that. What's a decision bank? It's somewhere where you can go online and see, areas of controversy and how the REB has decided. And you can ask the REB chair for clarification. My favorite example was I got told, so, I got a bit of, so sometimes I don't think I know who's worse, guilty of worse malfeasance, the researcher or the REB. So I got this note from the REB saying that I had to change the logo. So I called up the REB chair. I said, it's kind of nice that you're asking me to change the logo, but I don't quite understand why. I said, the only way I could think of a logo harming a patient participating in this study is if they walked out the door of, I was at Sunnybrook at the time, and a big gust of wind knocked the logo of the Sunnybrook Hospital off its sign and it landed on the patient's head, right? So again, that notion of proportionality. And if the REB doesn't get feedback about proportionality, they're going to sometimes make decisions that don't make sense. Literature and guidance, particularly in adaptive platform trials, is sparse. So there's a huge opportunity to contribute to research here and to improve practices. And as I've alluded to earlier, SARS-CoV-2 COVID pandemic increased our understanding about the strengths of adaptive platform trials, as well as some of the ethical challenges. So in that somewhat, I already said all that. In the somewhat sparse literature, there's an interesting paper by Bothwell and Kesselheim, which they were looking at adaptive methods. 2 minutes? Oh, I better hurry up. Wow, time goes fast. So scientific efficiency, economic value, and ethical value were posited as views. And so now going to speed mode. Thus, adaptive platform trial RB protocols and consent forms should be designed with extra care to clearly and effectively convey the trial design and allocation scheme to which patients could be assigned. And trial personnel taking patient consent should be granted extra time to explain the complexities of adaptive designs. And I think as Lisa's study, what we saw yesterday, is that time is a precious resource. Now I'm two-handing it. Oh, sorry, now I'm going too fast. So there's a big debate in the literature about whether adaptive trial platforms are more ethical than fixed RCT design. We heard a little bit about this yesterday. So in the paper that my colleague Jerome Singh said, the general idea is that fixed design is related in collective ethics. So there's no presumption of benefit to people enrolling in studies because the goal is to generate knowledge. Whereas an adaptive trial platform design is rooted in individual ethics. You're trying to actually ensure that enrolled subjects are getting the best possible treatment in the earliest possible time. And this raises a lot of concerns about informed consent. So the ethical issues relate to response adaptive randomization and frequent interim analysis. So response adaptive randomization permits randomization proportions to be varied during the course of the trial, and such reallocations between arms increases the fraction of participants who receive the most effective treatment. And that's, the idea here is that you can decrease the required sample by allocating participants to arms most likely to be efficacious. It's more efficient, lower sample size, less exposure to potentially ineffective treatment, but it also raises the possibility that subjects may want to wait. And, you consent and say, no, I'm going to wait till your Bayesian prior is a little more updated than it is right now, and take my chances on having a better and more successful outcome. And so critics of adaptive platform trials question whether increasing the proportion of subjects randomized to the more successful arm of the trial based on interim results is unethical in respect to equipoise, informed consent, justice, and potential investigator bias. So I forgot to put a resources slide, but I'll send to Andrew. If you're interested in these, even though it says emergency contexts, it actually holds for all adaptive platform designs. This is the paper by Jerome Singh. So there's concerns about timing of consent. Should they be informed as part of the informed consent process in the interest of beneficence and transparency, that they may stand a better chance of being assigned to a more efficacious intervention if they enroll later in the trial rather than at trial's initiation. But I do want to just quickly conclude. I'm running out of time. But another great paper by Jerome on clinical trial governance with respect to adaptive platform trials. So this is just a definition about clinical trial governance. I won't read it out in its entirety, but it's about the structures, processes, policies. And as a PI, you're kind of responsible for good governance. And I think Lisa will speak more about this. And the governance of adaptive platform trials are complex. You've got a variety of different instruments that you need to have in place, and you need all sorts of different governance instruments to make sure that you're meeting all of the requirements of good clinical practice. More on this later. So one of his recommendations, and I think this would be one, besides the two tables, a third takeaway from this talk, is if you're involved in a platform adaptive trial, convene an ethics working group. Again, you're not going, if you have ethics expertise working with you rather than waiting until you get to the REB, it can help you inform decision-making relating to the design and implementation of the trial and guiding the resolution of any emerging ethical issues in real time. By being embedded in the trial as a core support structure, the ethics working group can serve as an anchor on ethics issues and serve a valuable resource to other trial structures, including the PI and sponsors. So opportunities. Fortunately, I've already mentioned many of them, and I think this is my last slide. So my colleagues at the WHO have identified several of the problems that arose during the conduct of platform adaptive trials during COVID. So research ethics committees have struggled. Let's help them. How do we strengthen capacity? We need to work on that, particularly from a global perspective. Committee members, we need to train them up, and PIs can actually play a role in that. And researchers need to take responsibility for explaining their trial proposals clearly. So the onus is on the PI here. And more widely, the particular complexities of reviewing adaptive platform trials point to a longer-term need to develop more flexible, dynamic models of review, here, including the role of trial monitoring. So last point I'm going to make, we need a healthy and thriving research ecosystem. Learning health systems approach offers an opportunity to see innovative ways to build an empirical base for varied ethical challenges and optimizing adaptive trials. We need to fund studies on the consent experience and participant understanding of adaptive platform trials. We need to encourage mutual learning between researchers and REBs. And I think this can be done while preserving ethics review independence. I'll skip that. So a long time ago, when I got sort of tired of all of the complaints about REBs, I wrote this editorial, ask not what your REB can do for you, but what you can do for your REB. We can actually, as researchers, improve, it's in our hands to improve the process. Thank you. Appreciate your time and attention.